It's a great honor for me to welcome you today to the events on occasion of the European Day of Demography. My name is Andreas Edel. I'm the Executive Secretary of Population Europe, and it's my privilege to welcome you also on behalf of our co-organizers, the Federal Institute for Population Research, BIP, and the European Commission. Let me gratefully mention here on behalf of many who helped, Katja Patzwald from BIP and Dieter Zirgen from the cabinet of the EU Vice President, who both were instrumental in setting this day up. And of course, all the brave colleagues of the Population Europe team, which you can see also in the background. Actually, we are heavily delayed, as the European Day of Demography was already on the 4th of February. And it even refers to an event more than 350 years ago. On the 4th of February, 1662, John Grant finalized his famous analysis of the bills of mortality in his hometown, London, which became the first demographic and at the same time epidemiological study ever. So it's not an exaggeration to say that demography is one of the oldest empirical social sciences. And it was always considered policy relevant. Grant himself explicitly devoted his study to support the decision-making of his times in various policy fields with evidence from the data he analyzed. Finally, his study was widely recognized in Europe by other eminent scholars, but also politicians of his generation, and continues to do so until today, still being quoted in many publications globally and, of course, in Europe. This guides us also today when celebrating the European Day of Demography. As a discipline of high societal and political relevance and great relevance for our daily lives. A discipline with long-standing experience in the proper analysis of data and provision of evidence. And a discipline which, from its very beginning, was driven by international collaboration, not only among eminent researchers, but also stakeholders from policy, business, and civil society. This framing is also reflected in the many important institutions which support the event today. I already mentioned the Federal Institute and the European Commission, but also involved were the European Association for Population Studies, the Association Internationale de Demographes de Langue Française, the Associazione Italiana per gli Studi di Popolazione, the British Society for Population Studies, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Demographie, and the Nederlandse Vereniging for Demography. I would like to thank here all our fellow colleagues for their great support. Let me particularly thank the eminent scholars and colleagues who kindly volunteered today to contribute to the various panels and the evening event. We look very much forward to hear your views and to discuss with you and the audience about important demographic and societal challenges we face today. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Förderfonds Wissenschaft in Berlin, the Einstein Stiftung Berlin, and the Stifterverband for the kind support of the evening event. Without further ado, let me hand over now to my colleague, Nikola Sander. She's a research director at the Federal Institute for Population Research and head of the area Migration and Mobility in Wiesbaden in Germany. Nikola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and I'm very warm welcome to all of you from Wiesbaden in the west of Germany, where the day is foggy, but I think we have an exciting program here today ahead of us this afternoon. And we kick this day off with a panel on data. Data is the new oil, as its title. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel, where we have four renowned panelists that I invite to have their short interventions, their inputs, and then we'll have a discussion followed thereafter. For those of you who are watching in the audience, please use the Q&A for your questions, and we'll collect the questions there and then discuss it and address it later on. So please just use the Q&A and type your questions in there. Thank you. Okay, so our first panelist today will talk about data, I guess from a European perspective. Data is the new oil, of course, brings a lot of interesting questions also in demography, a very data-driven discipline, where we see exciting new data sources and new survey waves coming up with the Ukraine survey that will probably be mentioned later on in the second panel, but also big surveys like the GSUP, where we have new data being surveyed regularly, which extends our ability to address important questions in demographic research. But we also have data in fields that are not so related to demography, but perhaps to other disciplines, such as medicine, epidemiology, genetics, which I guess Melinda Mills will touch on later on, how we can actually use these data in demographic research as well. And then we have the field of new data sources that are coming up. A lot of us will think about social media like Twitter and Facebook when we think about new data sources, but there's also the big world of geocoded data, of satellite data that is rapidly expanding, and that we increasingly also use for demographic research, because much more data now is getting geocoded also in census rounds. So this extends our ability to touch on these new data sources, which I guess Tatem and Emilio Zagheni will touch on later on. So, without much further ado from my side, I'll now introduce Anne Gauthier. It's a pleasure to have you in the panel, Anne. Anne is, I have to look at my notes to get all these affiliations right. Anne is the director of the Generations in Gender program, the GGP, which is one of the biggest surveys in Europe. Senior researcher at the NIDI and professor of comparative family studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She holds a PhD in sociology from University of Oxford and a master's degree in demography from University of Montreal. And her expertise in research lies in cross-national studies on families, including fertility decisions, family policies, parenting, and transition to adulthood. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nikola. Let me share my screen for a very short presentation. And now it should be visible to all of you, right? In full screen. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm going to address the issue of data as the new oil, not surprisingly, from the point of view of cross-nationally comparable surveys. So obviously, we live in a world where we leave behind a whole lot of data. I mean, in times every week, every day, do we agree on various terms, usually even without reading them. These digital traces are extremely rich, as I'm sure will be addressed by the other speakers. But the point I want to make today is that survey data, although not new as data, are still essential. So I'll be really addressing two key questions. Why do we still need survey data in the current context? And what future with these data? But let me present one single example to you. And it comes from the field of family dynamics. The example I'm going to show illustrates what we're interested in is the whole changes in family dynamics. That is, what we're interested is how do people, at what time and if and when they form union, experience union dissolution, and have children or not. So the example here, I'll be using data for France and using a data visualization developed by Eugenio Paglino from Bocconi University and Tom Emery from Erasmus. So what you'll see here is very simple. On the horizontal axis, you have the number of children from 0 children to 3, 4 plus, and then 3 marital states on the vertical axis being single, cohabiting, or married. So as you can see there, age 18, most people are single and without children. Now, traditionally, the pattern was very simple. From being single, people would go straight into being married, and they would do so before having children. And then from that state of being married, they would obviously progress to have 1, 2, or 3 children. Nowadays, the lives of people have become very complex. Here is one such pathways. Somebody from being single becomes enter a cohabitation, decides to have a child within cohabitation, after a few years may get married, may progress to have a second child, and then may experience union dissolution and return. So this is extremely complex and yet super important for us to understand as demographers. So let me show you the visualization here, and you'll see how the full dynamics of once people start being in this single state and then following different pathways at different age in their life course, distribute themselves in these. So I think this is really powerful. And I think what it captured here is with such survey data, we're able to capture the changes across cohorts in family dynamics, the change, also the difference across countries, but also the large increasing variation in these different pathways. And importantly, when we use also data that we collect on their health and well-being, for example, we're able to identify where the inequalities lies and the most vulnerable pathways or families. So this is to the question of why do we need survey data, simply that they're not available. Several of these data are not available from other sources. So the type of data I illustrated here with the data visualization, detailed data on life histories, life trajectories are simply not available. Think also about data on the intention to have children, intention to migrate, again, not available from other sources. The gender division of housework, unpaid work, or the attitude towards gender role, for example. Second, we also need survey data, but cross-naturally comparable one, to test our theories. So many of our theories were developed on the basis of Western European countries. And yet it raised the question of whether these theories, being on fertility and gender equality or being on other topics, are applicable in other settings and contexts. Are they applicable in Eastern and Central Europe? Are they applicable in Latin America or Asia? This is here that this is the big contribution of survey data to the advancement in our field of research. Let me quickly move on to what's the future of survey data. And the first answer is, while I'm arguing here that survey data are essential, it's clear that their richness will come when combining them with other data sources, being administrative sources or even newer sources of data. Let me give you a few examples here. What we can therefore do is to follow longitudinally the survey respondent, even after we stop interviewing them. You can use administrative data to continue their life course to see if they ended up having children, ended up divorcing or repartnering, for example. Swedish colleagues have been able to do that using the generation and gender survey data, combining it with the register in order to follow people way beyond the survey, the different waves of the survey itself. We can also follow people, for example, if they migrate to a different countries using other form of data. But we could do even more here. We could think of linking survey data to what people would post online, for example, to capture their opinion, their taste, or linking them with other platforms such as LinkedIn to understand their work trajectory. So obviously here, data protection regulation are our biggest enemy, but theoretically, this is where we would get way more leverage with our data as the new oil. But the future of survey data also implied trying to do much better with what we're currently doing. The responses rate to survey data have been declining everywhere. Interestingly, people do agree to leave their data on all sort of digital platform, but when it comes to participating in survey, they agree much less to do so. This makes for us as researchers, much more difficult to claim that the data come from representative sample of the population, which used to be a bit our added value here. And even worse, in a sense, some subgroup continue to be really underrepresented in surveys. Think of those with lower level of education or with a migrant background. We therefore need to do a way better job in finding ways to get them to participate in surveys. And I don't have the answer here, but I think it's important to flag this. So in short, and concluding here, are survey data the new oil? Well, they're not new, but they're really absolutely essential to monitor changes, demographic change, to understand people's life trajectories, and especially to identify these moments of vulnerabilities and inequalities. But as I said, I think we can do even better, especially if we combine with other sources. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for these important points on the challenges and potentials of survey data for demographic research. And we'll move straight on to our next panelist, who is Melinda Mills, who is a professor of sociology at the Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. Her research spans a very interesting interdisciplinary range of topics, the intersection of demography, sociology, genetics, and statistics. And topic-wise, she focuses on fertility and human reproductive behavior, on mating behavior, labor markets, life course research, and inequality. Melinda Mills, the floor is yours. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm just working out sharing my screen here. Apologies, everyone. Just give me a moment. Okay, there we go. This is what happens when you have many things open on your screen. I'm hoping you can see it now. I just wanted to give some examples of how we leverage data to solve key societal challenges and some of the things that we've done in our center, and then move on to think about some of the ethical aspects about what this new data and what this new oil is and how we can think about it. I think Anne gave an excellent introduction because she was talking about some of the data. So what is this data? It's survey data and supplementing survey data. It's register data, and it's also data from commercial companies. So just to give you an example of some of the things that we've done, it's European Demography Day. So I'm thinking about some of the things that have happened in the past 3 years since we launched our Demographic Science Center at Oxford. And one of the things we realized was that we could just use basic data that was available about demography and the composition of populations to make a change and try to understand, for example, during COVID, how the demographic composition of a population and the infection rate and the mortality rates in different age groups you could actually predict what was going to happen just based on the age structure of different populations. We also did this in England and Wales, for example, to just look what is the demographic composition and what are some of the things related to mortality, the factors related to mortality during COVID, such as social deprivation, ethnicity, and we could actually predict healthcare demand and which hospitals would become overwhelmed in which areas at which time. So just using basic demography and existing data. So demography has become increasingly more important, and we've been able to use it in very practical and policy related ways. Also during COVID, we were able to think more in terms of combining social network data. We have a lot of this data from social media, but also surveys, and to try to think about how people interact with each other and how you could engage in sort of policy related matters. And this was during COVID, for example, to think about people on same work shifts working together, or school bubbles in classrooms. And these were used in different companies, but also in different school and university settings. So just understanding the demographic composition, I think, has become something that's very basic for demographers, but has become increasingly important in policy circles. And with researchers at Max Planck, but also within our center, this just shows a tip of the iceberg of work of Ridi Kashap and Jose Manuel Alberto in our center. But really, using survey data, as Anne Gauthier was just saying, and leveraging it with all types of different kinds of data to try to look at life expectancy, mortality, and lifespan inequality. So there's just so many uses of data that have been so practical over the last 3 years. And as alluded to, one of the areas that our center and I've examined in more detail is how can we leverage biological and genetic data to try to understand things that we've been looking at in demography for many years. So this is about the timing and number of fertility and entry into first sex. And we found genetic variants that are very much linked to externalizing behavior, so self-control, ADHD, and other factors. But we'll have a paper coming out this week or next where we're linking additional genetic variants to concrete factors related to infertility, specifically for men, which we know less about. So just going in as a demographer, we've always been transdisciplinary, but using and leveraging all these different types of biosocial data, geocoded data, survey, administrative, and social media data has been really useful in terms of looking at old questions in new ways, but also asking fundamentally new kinds of questions. And as well, I'm sure Andy Tatem, who will speak, will perhaps talk about this. This was using some of the social media advertising data that Emilio will be talking about, I'm sure, as well. The demographers are great at working together as well, too. And we use some of these techniques that we've developed over the years to look at population displacement in Ukraine, working together with the WHO and United Nations to have some real world impact on repositioning people and knowing which populations are where at what time. But just to conclude, I want to, as usual, just reflect on this. So we have, it's actually, as Anne Gauthier was saying, it's our personal data and it's the new oil. So I just wanted to reflect on a new thing that we're thinking about, and that's sort of taking a more ethical stance towards this data and trying to understand it. So I use a lot of genetic data, and we've used social media data. And by being funded by the European Research Council, the question is often, well, do people really know, have they consented to their data being used? And we know from many of these companies that data is often resold and reused. So we've started to reflect a little bit more and started a new initiative to try to use data from people where we think and that they understand the consent and the use of their data. So just basically building on GDPR, the General Data Protection legislation that was brought in May 2018 in Europe. We're thinking a lot about consent. Do people really understand how their data is being used, and do they understand the risks and benefits? So we've started a new initiative, Data to the People. It will be launched within the next month. And, the problem is really a lot of the data that we've been analyzing, the Twitter data, the Google data, the Facebook data, the LinkedIn data, wearables, genetic data is held by commercial companies. And people are often unaware of the kind of profile that's going on and, what they could learn from it. So we're launching a new platform of ethical crowdsourcing data where people can donate their data. It's clearly governed and transparent, but more importantly, we're going to allow ethical reuse. So people will be able to download all types of data. They'll be able to connect it to existing surveys and also conduct additional surveys, and that will be ethically reused by other scientists. So I just wanted to reflect on this because we're trying to think of how we can take this oil and use it in a new ethical way. And you can imagine there's many different types of data and things that you can think about. So you can look at when you're on Facebook, all of your movements, how you're targeted, what you watch on YouTube. All of this is actually readily available for researchers to analyze, but we also want people to know what kind of data is collected about them as well. So that's data to the people to end, and that's some of the uses that we've used of this new oil of data. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melinda. This sounds like a really relevant initiative, data to the people. So I also agree that the ethical use from a personal perspective, but also from a perspective of a researcher, needs to know what is actually, where's the data coming from, who's measuring what is the algorithm doing behind my data, how is that affecting perhaps my results that I'm gaining. This is a really important point here in this discussion. So moving on, having said this, to the next speaker, welcoming Andy Tatem, our next panelist. Andy is a professor of spatial demography and epidemiology in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Southampton. He is also the director of the WorldPop project and the Flowminder Foundation, both of which focus on supporting low and middle income countries and improving their demographic evidence bases, primarily for disease control and humanitarian crisis response. So very excited to hear about this. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Share my screen, and thank you to Melinda and Anne for setting this up so nicely. I'm a geographer more than a demographer, so I'm going to talk about geospatial data as our new data source. So we're talking about what can we learn from new sources. So I'm going to start by saying what are these new sources in terms of from our perspective. You probably see just a mess here. This is a satellite image of a settlement of about the scale when I was doing my PhD. Nowadays, we're working with images like this, where we can see individual buildings, sometimes people, cows, and even that's not so new. We've had these images maybe for 10 years now. What's some of the new parts I see is the ability with AI, with computer vision, to be able to extract data like this, the individual buildings across an entire country, pretty accurately in a fraction of the time it took last year. And this is accelerating. We can take those kinds of data and we can use these kind of computing powers and algorithms to identify the patterns in those buildings, to identify types of neighborhoods. We can look at which types of buildings tend to be residential or non-residential and be able to map those out. There are colleagues of ours who are working on being able to map out building heights, types of building as well. So as long as there is some kind of survey data and training data, the big possibilities of these types of algorithms. And of course, these images have been collected all the time. So there's the possibility to map that change over time. It's not just images of the Earth in the daytime. There's images at night that give us a different type of picture of populations and their distributions. And there are all kinds of types of metrics, vegetation, land cover, topography, as well as all of these geocoded data sets that we've heard about already, but also kind of points of interest. So hospitals, health facilities, schools, places to eat, road networks are all increasingly being mapped, as well as these kinds of data that Melinda just talked about. So Google, Facebook, tech companies looking at the movement of our smartphones, of our accounts, mobile phone network providers being able to undertake analysis of movements of smartphones and non-smartphones across countries. So where this comes in value, I think, to demography and being able to understand smaller area dynamics is being able to build up a picture of a landscape through things that correlate with populations and their characteristics, but not actually completely directly measuring them. So we can start to build up a picture. It looks more like this with these geospatial data sets of things relating to population. And the value here is to be able to use that in the case where we cannot feasibly go and count everybody every single day. We can't go and do a survey every single day. But these data sets provide a way of filling in gaps, adding more spatial detail to be able to capture things like population distributions, demographics, and dynamics at smaller scales. And I'll just give some very quick examples. This is one where we have a country that hasn't done a census since 1979, Afghanistan, but has been able to collect small area data in areas it can access the government. But the potential is to utilize that stack of geospatial data, understand the relationships between those population densities where we can measure it, and these geospatial data that we have everywhere to be able to then develop models to predict those population numbers. Importantly, with confidence intervals around them, because they're not perfect, but they do a pretty good job. And this provides opportunities to tackle questions like how many people are at risk of a 1 in 100-year flood. We can, with satellites, identify the outline of that flood and then estimate the populations. And this is the kind of things that are now being used in disaster response. In healthcare, how many women at childbearing age live within 2 hours of a birthing facility? And map out those estimated pregnancies, link those with data on travel times to be able to estimate those numbers for various strategic policy relevant reports. Demographics, we've heard about survey data. Often those survey clusters, the samples are geolocated now. It gives us a sample data for certain locations. We can then, just like in the Afghanistan example, link those and understand the statistical model to relate those characteristics with the geospatial data. Sometimes it works well, sometimes not, but we can produce these predictions of these population characteristics in areas where we just have a sparsity of data. And this enables questions about where and who are unvaccinated children, in this case, Nigeria. And these data are used to identify areas of low vaccination coverage and plan vaccination campaigns. One of the drivers of school attendance in a district, we can identify not only the locations of low school attendance, but also the factors associated with them when we link together survey data with these geospatial data sets, and then feed those into things like, in this case, Sierra Leone, using these kinds of data for school infrastructure and catchment area planning. And then finally, population dynamics, maybe Emilio will touch on, but be able to look at the density of phones here and build a model to translate it into population counts rather than phone counts by linking with census data. We can see some of the dynamics that we've never been able to see before without these kinds of new rich sources of data. And this enables us to think about how are migration patterns changing subnationally, what are the drivers, and develop models built on these data to estimate those migration flows, how they're changing at different timescales, and use those in the health field. For instance, how does seasonal migrations drive measles outbreaks? This is just looking at the brightness fluctuations in satellite images of the Earth at night as large numbers of migrants move in the dry season, and enables the timing of vaccination campaigns for measles. So I want to just caveat with, this is not all perfect. We may see, in this case, a satellite image of Pakistan, 2 villages that look identical pretty much from space. We may be able to just estimate that there are 5 people per compound, but it's only by linking with other data sources that we can see that actually in one area of the country, the household size typically is much higher than the other, and we would get our population numbers very wrong. So key things I think to not forget are that buildings don't equal people, phones don't equal people, and just echoing the message, I think, of the previous 2 speakers, importance of combining different data types, modeling those processes and measuring, communicating uncertainty. And so these geospatial data, I think, are a powerful complement to traditional demographic data, but not a replacement. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for these very exciting insights into research in very different parts of the world than what we are residing on here, and what we can do in the absence of existing data sources where there's no surveys and recent census rounds. So very exciting. And our fourth speaker will complement this picture here. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Emilio Zagheni, who's the director of the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock. And he's also an affiliate associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington. Emilio is perhaps best known for his work on combining digital trace data and traditional data sources to understand migration and other demographic phenomena, and for building up the research lab in Rostock now, who's doing work on computational demography. So very exciting to have you here, Emilio, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikola, for this very nice and generous introduction. Let me share my slides. Let's see, you should be able to see them now. All right, well, thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this panel today, which is also part of the European Day of Demography. Now, the title of this panel is Data is the New Oil. When I initially read the title, the very first image that came to my mind was something like this. This is an image that has been also popularized in the press and sort of connotates data as something that could be extracted, that needs to be refined, and eventually it could power the scientific enterprise. Now, that's one way of sort of seeing data as the new oil, but I would like you to also think of data as the new oil in a slightly different way. And so I would sort of think of the oil that artists use, the oil that we use for painting. It's a different type of oil. It can be used by artists to produce all sorts of artistic productions. It can be combined, and this is a thing that has been already present in this panel quite substantially. We might have sort of key colors that generate all sorts of shades, but really once we have these colors, we can produce an infinite number of artistic products. Now, as part of this panel, we've already seen a number of a large number of different types of new data that could be used and combined for demography research. For my short input, I would like to focus on one specific example of data, and that is one type of data that we can use in order to learn more about migration of scholars. So these are individuals that are highly skilled. They can lead to innovation, economic development, and so on. They're an important target of policies, but we know very little about them because we don't have much data. But there's one data source that is sort of changing things, and that's bibliometric data. Now, to introduce you to bibliometric data, I will get some help from one of our panelists, one of my fellow panelists here, Melinda Mills. We all know Melinda. She's great. She has published an incredible number of papers that are all very interesting. And if we know her personally, we may also know about her sort of geographic trajectory. But now, what if we didn't know her and wanted to know something about her patterns over time? Well, what we could do is to look at metadata from publications. So for example, we can see that Melinda published an article in 2013, and at that time she was affiliated with the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. We can assume that she was there at that time. We can look at an article in 2015. At that time, Melinda was affiliated with the University of Oxford. And so we can quickly infer that most likely sometime between 2013 and 2015, Melinda moved from the Netherlands to the UK. So it's a simple idea, so using metadata from publications, but it's also something that can be easily scaled. And this is because of the increasing availability of large-scale index and citation databases like the Scopus database that we've been using at the Max Planck Institute for Demography Research. This includes, for example, more than 77 million publications published by more than 16 million authors with more than 70,000 affiliations. So this is a very helpful type of data source. But what can we learn? What can we learn as demographers? Well, first of all, so let me give you just like a few examples. We can learn that we can actually measure scholarly migration. This is a map that shows at the global scale out-migration rates for scholars. It gives us a sense of the heterogeneity across countries, and also potentially points to some countries like African countries where out-migration rates might be potentially very, very high and might sort of lead to issues of brain drain and so on. This is out-migration rates. We could estimate in-migration rates. We could do it at different geographic scales for different temporal levels and so on. Now, beyond measuring, we can also address long-standing questions in demography and in migration studies. So, for example, what is the relationship between out-migration and economic development? This is a long-standing question. In this figure, we see out-migration rates on the y-axis and GDP per capita on the x-axis. Now, there are a lot of details in this figure that I'm not going to sort of discuss, but we can see that there is this U-shaped pattern. Initially, out-migration decreases and then increases. And this is actually the opposite of what we observe for the overall population, where migration tends to increase first and then decrease. And so these types of analysis could not have been done without these types of new data. And they enable us to get a better sense of heterogeneity across populations, as well as address issues that are policy relevant, like migration of scientists. A third example, and this is something in collaboration with our colleagues at the University of Oxford, in particular with Ridi Kashap, is to assess gender inequalities in science. Say, if this figure shows on the x-axis the gender ratios among all researchers. So this is number of female researchers divided by number of male researchers. If we had the same number of men and women in science, we would be at around 1, but the median is at about 0.47 for the period 1998 to 2022. On the y-axis, we see the same type of statistic, but for migrant researchers. And that's even lower. So even fewer women are internationally mobile, but we know that like international mobility is an important factor in advancing people's career, expanding people's network, and so on. So this is something that is quite worrying. And we can see that there is a large gap compared to sort of the 45-degree line. Now, on the positive side, if we look at trends over time from 1998 to the latest data available, we see that this gap has been shrinking. It was 0.42 here, it's 0.24 here. So this is an example of another policy relevant type of question that can be addressed using these types of data. Now, let me sort of step back for a moment. I showed you one example of data, and I also pointed to the fact that we should see this data as something for artists that could be used in creative ways. At the same time, the data that we use for these images are proprietary data. And so this sort of brings back to this type of image. And so we need to be aware of this because not everybody could have access to them, or people should sort of pay for this data, and the cost could be quite high. And so this brings me to an effort that we are making, which is to sort of generate databases that sort of remove the commercial value of this data. So once we sort of aggregate data and we sort of remove IDs and so on, this data lose the commercial value for which sort of Scopus sells the data, but they do remain valuable for scientific purposes. And so the idea is that this data can be aggregated into a scholarly migration database that includes all these flows on a global scale by gender at different levels of spatial and temporal granularity. This is something that will be inaugurated at PEA. If you're interested, feel free to join us to learn more about the database. But more broadly, this is an example of sort of unlocking the data, similar to the efforts that Melinda earlier mentioned related to data to the people and so on. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilio. I'm looking forward to the new database on migrating scholars. That's a great initiative to hear. I would now like to open the floor for discussions, for questions from the audience. As mentioned before, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to type in your questions that you have to the panelists. And while we're getting ready, I'm probably starting this off with a question from myself, probably in the direction to Melinda. You've shown some research about COVID and demographic consequences. And I was wondering whether you think, has COVID changed the value and relevance of data for demographic research?
Yeah, so I think COVID changed a lot of things in our lives. It changed a few things. One is that it exposed which data we didn't have that we desperately needed. So there were some very basic things at the start of the pandemic, such as fatality rates broken down by age and sex and region and geocoded and all of that information. So it exposed for many countries the lack that they couldn't access or even release that data in real time. Sometimes they had it, but they just didn't have the structures and the regulations to be able to release it in time. So that was interesting. And I think as a result, a lot of countries in the European Union and they're thinking about how they can be ready for something like that. And I think the second thing is it sped up the release of data and it opened up. So from commercial companies right down to governments, they were more willing to allow broader data uses. So that was interesting. And that seems to have sped up a lot of different processes. And I guess it also just revealed the importance of demographic compositions of populations. And I think particularly policymakers it became very clear, wait a minute, if we know our population composition, we'll be able to, predict services for hospitals and education. I mean, I think they already knew this for a long period of time, but it became acutely important, at that period of time. And I guess the other thing was just creative uses of data. So as all of the speakers were saying, and I'd be interested in their reflections on this too, is just the triangulation of all these different types of data were really important. And what Andy was saying about showing the confidence intervals around it, just saying that, there's always uncertainty in these estimates. So, I think it changed a lot of things, but it definitely brought demography and the importance of demography to the fore because, many demographers were out there focusing on those issues.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the other speakers, does anyone of you want to respond to this or add your perspective to this question? If not, then we'll move on to some questions from the Q&A. The first question came up during Emilio's input, so I presume that it relates to that, perhaps not entirely specific. It reads, what kind of non-conventional data can we use for monitoring the odds in a developing country? So I guess it relates to the Scopus data for developing countries and how useful they are in these contexts.
Yeah, so maybe I can address this question, and I would say that I presented one example of data that is potentially relevant also for low-income countries, but there are all sorts of data, and really, in particular for low-income countries, I think that the key is the combination of data, and in particular the combination of surveys and potentially social media platform or other platforms that enable people to address or to find samples of respondents. And it's not only the combination, but it's also the development of methods. So once we have these new types of approaches that combine survey methods with non-probabilistic samples, then like there are all sorts of issues because we sort of move away from areas where we have like clear theories on how to sort of proceed. But then there are very exciting developments based on sort of network-based sampling that may sort of lead us to find ways that reduce the biases to an extent that like all these types of information become particularly useful. And so I would say the key for low-income countries would be combination of surveys with various platforms. And then in the context of bibliometric data, that's also something that there are some data that are proprietary like Scopus, but also other initiatives like OpenAlex that sort of make them available. And then there will be this scholarly migration database that will make all these statistics available for all countries for which there's a minimum number of scholars. You're muted, Nikola.
I hope this answered the question of our audience member. Thank you. I move on to one. This is perhaps relating to all of you, all of the speakers, which is more of a general questions about data as the new oil, which is about given the increasing awareness of individuals and companies of the value of data. I feel most companies are clamping down on free and readily available data. Do you believe this is actually the case, that readily available data is becoming less and less, that companies are clamping down on them? And do you think this will continue in the future? Who would like to respond to this?
I can, or Andy, you go ahead, and then I'll
just do a quick response. I mean, I can give from the perspective of mobile network providers, and that we started working with these kinds of data back in 2008, and yeah, I would agree that then the value of those data were not fully known or fully exploited as it was, in terms of using that word, but and over the years, yes, many mobile operators, tech companies have realized that there is a lot of money to be made. There are mobile network companies that have entire data analytics arms that are selling analytics to private companies on mobility. Having said that, there are also many mobile operators who have a social good side to them, and that they are making available those data in sensitive, I guess, forms that are that take away some of the sensitivities of those kinds of data, and we've seen advances because of that. But it's still, yeah, I think it's still dominated by the most analytics is the most advanced are being done for commercial purposes. I'm sure Melinda has other.
Well, yeah, I guess I completely agree with you, and I'd be interested maybe in Emilio and other opinions on this, because you use a lot of social digital trace data. We definitely noticed with in the genetic data, but also some of the media data, that increasingly data was being blocked, data usage. So for some of the large genetic companies that I used to participate with, that was no longer available because they had perhaps sold that phenotype to a pharmaceutical company, so we could no longer look at that trait anymore. But also, you know, companies such as Twitter, as we know, are changing, and academic use for APIs is also changing as well too. So I think that's why it'll be interesting to watch this space, because we've noticed a lot more clamping down on usage. But there's also the flip side, that we're Also, if you want to ethically use it, it's very unclear if people really understood what data was being collected from them and how it was being used when they were signing the privacy and the cookies. Once you get into looking at your own mobility data, like we did, and all of your data, what we did in Data to the People, even I was pretty surprised at, you know, my YouTube watches and searches at where I was and the time, and all of these things are collected to develop a very accurate profiling of behavior and to predict behavior. And imagine if we could harness that for scientific research and not just marketing and commercial purposes. Emilio, maybe you want to say something.
Yeah, so I want to add something to that. I agree with what Andy and Melinda have already said. I think that in the context, for example, of social media, there have been some sort of different waves. So at the very beginning, that leads to sort of different types of inequalities in access. I think that's the key. At the beginning, it was like the people were well connected with these companies who had access. Then sort of like that decreased a little bit, and there was like a little bit of a boom. Certain things could be available more democratically to anybody. Now it seems like it's getting more difficult again to sort of access the data, and the barriers are that maybe people who are still connected with the companies can get access, but also, or people who are sort of working on things that are of relevance for the companies can get access, and people who might be willing to pay, or people who have the resources to pay. And so that sort of creates some barriers, so that like it might lead to some inequalities in increased inequalities in the scientific sort of use of these data sources. But on the other hand, we see like projects like what Melinda said on sort of data donation, thanks to legislation like the GDPR and other types of laws that are sort of catching up with that. There are possibilities to sort of unlock this data as long as people are willing to sort of make it available for science. And it's not only, and also with social media like TikTok, like there are a number of projects now that sort of rely on people donating TikTok data. And this is something that would not be otherwise available, but more and more people are interested and willing to do so. So there are some trade-offs, and we need to sort of work hard to move towards like a more equitable access to this data and ethical.
And you would also like to comment on this?
Yeah, just a small point that I mentioned, and then it came back in the sense that there's the danger here that who will donate their data, who will make their data available to us, who understand the value of data as the new oil, are the highly educated people. This is a bias that's quite clear in survey research, but I'm sure it'll be the same in some of the initiatives mentioned here. So this is something that we have a responsibility to work really hard on that front to make sure that we don't have just the data among basically ourselves and the people like us, where then that advanced some demographic research, but we would be missing out a lot. So I think I would be challenging all of us to really think hard in that direction.
Thank you. So looking at the clock, it's time already to close this panel. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions that were posed by the audience. So I'm returning back to thanking again all the panelists and the speakers for their valuable input. Of course, thanks for being here and for sharing your insights on our day of demography. And with that, I'm giving back to Andreas.
Thank you so much, Nikola, and also to all the colleagues for this really exciting panel. And one could actually spend a whole workshop on this. So thanks a lot for this valuable input. We have now a short break until 2:15, and you can use the same link for the whole day. You can use also then in a quarter of an hour when we meet again to continue then with our discussions about populations under threat. So thank you so much also to the panelists here in this panel, and then see you later in 15 minutes. Bye.